Welcome, everyone, to Covenant Health Ethic and Discernment Center's quarterly ethics seminar. We're very pleased to have so many people join us today on our session on responsibility. My name is Cecilia Marion, and I recently joined the team as a clinical ethicist, and it's my privilege to be your MC today. We'll take a few minutes before we have our reflection today, just to do some comments. So,
join in that thing.
We have
Sam, you're going to the gym?
a mute function. If you can please mute your mics during the presentations,
Thanks.
that would be appreciated. And then when we have our small group sessions, so for sure, please take yourself off mute and join the discussions. If during the presentations you have any thoughts or reflections of your own, just pop them in the chat box, and Oge and I will try to follow up with those comments and make sure our presenters can see them, because often when you're presenting, you actually can't see the comments coming through. Today's session, as you already heard, will be recorded with the intent of making it available on our website with all our other quarterly session recordings, and we encourage you to go back and take a look at any of those. They're all quite informative. Great to have watch that while you're munching on your lunch during your lunch hour. I heard today on the radio, one of the things that keeps people happy, they were doing some discussion on happiness, was continually learning new things that helps with people being happy. So we've got lots of ethics seminars on our website, and you can look at those, and maybe that'll help keep you happy, keep learning about things. One last thing, we always want feedback about our sessions. So I'll remind you again at the end.
No problem.
That we'll provide to you if you would give us feedback, so we know what to do next time and what topics you're interested in and whether the sessions are helpful to you or not. This time, I'd like to invite Rick Klein to open our session and our time together with a reflection. I can see Rick on the screen, and he is a chaplain at the Banff Mineral Springs Hospital, and he's also the chair of the Banff Ethics Committee. So welcome, Rick.
Thank you very much. I wanted to just kind of open up with a Jewish perspective from an ethical point of view. So that's been, of course, my background. So in Judaism, there's two key concepts regarding ethical behavior, and that is respect and responsibility. And since we're talking about responsibility today, I thought I would just provide you with a little reflection on how we view responsibility. So according to one of our great sages, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, who's known as Maimonides, he was arguably probably the greatest philosopher and theologian in Judaism. He lived in the 12th century of the Common Era. And he taught that ethical behavior starts with the individual. It's the responsibility of each of us to act ethically. But before we can do that, we have to do our own inner work to become better human beings. So in Judaism, the word for sin or, wrongdoing is het. And het actually means missing the mark, which means that it is not abnormal for us to sin. That in fact, this is really the way of the world. And that sinning, doing wrong, actually gives us an opportunity to learn, to grow, and possibly transform ourselves so that through our interactions with other people and with experiencing the world, we can actually make this a better world. So, sometimes when we hurt others, we don't even realize it. We don't realize that something that we've said, something that we've done actually has a huge impact on others. And so in Judaism, we are supposed to constantly be looking at and analyzing what we do and how we do it. So the way to deal with missing the mark or sinning is through the process called tshuva. And tshuva is interpreted as repentance. But the word tshuva itself means means returning. And it's the idea is that we want to return to our higher self, to our divine nature. That all of us, we were brought here in the image of God, which the Bible says. And the idea is to emulate the divine the best way we can. And the way to do that is to really be in touch with what we're doing, how we're doing it, and making changes if it's not right. So what we try to do is strive for this divine state of being so that we can act ethically to be the best human being that we possibly can be. So since sincere repentance requires not only reforming our behavior, but also to change your character traits. This is a big deal. So that, when we repent, when we actually are trying to return to our higher self, we're not only trying to just change the behavior, we're trying to change those basic character traits that we may have taken on for whatever reason. So according to Maimonides, again, there are 4 steps for us to practice, and this is the key. So the first thing, it starts with the mind. It starts with being aware of the things that we're doing, the things that we're saying, the way that we hurt people, the way that we, carry on in society that may not be the right thing. But if we're not aware of it, we're not going to do anything about it. So it's really that introspection, that going inward, looking at what we're doing, how we're doing it, the way we're saying it, and reflecting, can we do better? So that's the first step is the mind, recognizing that, we do wrong. The second step is going into the heart. And the idea there is that to feel what we did, not just to think about it, intellectualize it, but when you go into the heart and you actually feel the remorse, you feel the wrongdoing, you feel the regret, you feel the embarrassment. This is the heart field really now starting to take over and allowing us to make the change that we can really make. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to have a coherence between the mind and the heart. And when we get into that coherent state, then we can make the changes and desist, first of all, from that action and start to make the character changes that can not only allow us to grow, but to allow us to transform. And then once we've done those 3 things, so being aware with the mind, bring it into our heart, feeling the remorse, and then doing the action, desisting from that particular wrongdoing, from that particular sin. And not just consciously repressing it, but actually changing our character traits so we don't do it anymore. And then once you've done those 3 things, the final step is confession. It's really important then to go and verbalize and confess to the person you did the wrong to. And in Judaism, we can, we repent and we ask God for forgiveness. But when we do something against another human being, we are obliged to go to that human being and ask specifically for confession, but do it through the process. In other words, we have to recognize what we did was wrong. We have to take it into our heart and be remorseful when we have to change our action. And then we can go to that person and ask for forgiveness, but only once we've confessed and explained to them we've gone through those steps. And that final step of changing the action has to be permanent. In other words, if we've actually made that change and we're no longer doing it, then the person who we wronged has to forgive us. And in Judaism, we can go back 3 times and ask for forgiveness as long as we've done and gone through that process. And after the 3rd time, if the person refuses to forgive you, then it's on them. But you can be free of what you've done. So this is the real basic part, I think, of being ethical, is that to work on ourselves first, to see the things that we're doing wrong, to see the things that we can do better and actually make those changes. And when we can do that, then we can help others in terms of their ethical behavior and helping them help others. So I just want to wish everybody a very happy spring, and may your work, their inner work that you do, bring out the new growth, the buds and the blossoms, so that they will eventually turn into the beautiful, loving fruit that we all can be and provide to our our friends and patients and neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick. That was a beautiful reflection. I was just thinking about how I think I get stuck in the heart part of it, and sometimes more about myself in terms of kind of beating up on myself when I miss the mark. So it's a great reminder to always look at that as an opportunity to do something different and to change who you are and how you are in the world. So thank you very much for that. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So just going to remind people again to mute because there was a lot of background noise while Rick was doing his presentation. So thank you very much for doing that. So now I'm honored to introduce our presenters. And today we have two presenters, Eleanor Stewart and Scott Stewart, not related. It's Stewart and Stewart today. So Eleanor she holds a doctorate in rehab medicine with a focus on healthcare ethics. She was awarded a Social Services and Humanity Research Council of Canada Doctoral Fellowship for her research on ethical practice. In 2019, she was awarded the Covenant Health Mission Awards for Social Justice. And Eleanor's interest in ethics grew from her experience working with children and families with complex neurodevelopmental disabilities. She became involved with the ethics community as a member of the ethics committee at the Glenrose Rehab Hospital and a member of her professional association in college. Eleanor has two daughters, a cat and a dog. Sometimes the cat blesses Eleanor's performances by wandering through, which we love to see. And she has a beautiful garden. She's our first presenter, and she'll provide information on theory and the background of responsibility. I'm going to introduce Scott too, and then they'll just move from one presentation into the next. So Scott Stewart works for Covenant Health. He has a master's in social work. He's a registered social worker with 20 years of experience in healthcare. He has worked in numerous programs, including acute care, addiction, and mental health, and continuing care. Scott has just an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise, and is just always so willing to share that, as is Eleanor. Scott's presentation will be a discussion on how healthcare as a social institution is founded upon sustaining and sustained by the idea that we are responsible for one another and to one another. So welcome to Eleanor and Scott. Thank you both for sharing your knowledge with us, and we'll move into the presentations.
Okay. So I have to confess that I've thought about responsibility for a long time. And the personal challenge for me, and it may be the same for you, is to figure out where my responsibility, the scope of my responsibility. You know, I'm a clinical ethicist. I'm a mother. I'm a pet owner. So there are multiple points of responsibility for me, and not always clear to me, you know, what my scope of responsibility is. But also in my clinical work, working with patients, residents, families, and the staff that I work with, I still, you know, struggle and think about responsibility. So doing this seminar gave me an opportunity to dive into the literature, the philosophical literature on responsibility, and to think about it in a deeper way, and to ask what it's all about. And eventually, of course, as we move through this seminar today, we'll get to more practical matters, but I do want to sort of take this time to sort of flesh out what responsibility is. So working in the area of ethics, I mostly think about what goes on in terms of right and wrong actions. And I focus on people's actions and the options for actions and the justifications. But I recognize that in our lived experiences, I think we switch it up a bit because we also sense something about people's character traits, their virtues and their vices in the mix. So in this presentation, I offer a bit of both. I focus on the interpersonal aspects of responsibility, so a micro view, whereas my colleague Scott will be taking the larger societal view of responsibility. So let us get started. So in the way that we often think in three parts. So I'm responsible to someone for something in the face of some kind of consequence with regard to some standard and within a frame of relevant actions. So let me spell this out kind of using this example of us being here together. So I'm responsible to you for sharing my knowledge on responsibility theories to meet the learning objectives to a standard of adequate and I hope excellent, depends on your expectations, in a way that you generally expect of a seminar. So it might be a bit clumsy, but that's kind of the common understanding of responsibility. And we use the word responsible every day. Responsibility, responsible. So it's your responsibility to do this. I watch English League football. So Jurgen Klopp took responsibility for the loss, Liverpool being my team. Susan has a lot of responsibility as a doctor, or who is responsible for this child. So there are other words floating in the background here, like obligation and duty, accountability, liability, and authority. But as you can see in the examples here, not all of these examples will concern me because they're not all about moral responsibility, which is going to be my focus. So we talk about responsibility with adjectives like legal responsibility, corporate responsibility, social responsibility. So our focus here is moral responsibility. So I would be remiss not to point out the link between free will and moral responsibility. In our next seminar, we'll spend time talking about free will. But there is a link, and I do want to acknowledge it. So here's a quote from an Australian organization that I thought was a good one to pin down for us. There, as you can imagine, there are lots of things that can be said about free will and defined in a number of ways, but this one could be useful for us. Free will describes our capacity to make choices that are genuinely our own. With free will comes the moral responsibility, our ownership of our good and bad deeds. So the standard view is that free will is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. But that's contested, and I'll say a bit about that in this presentation. And so we're just going to leave that piece there for now, and we'll move on to, there's lots in philosophy that could be said about responsibility. But there are three strands of sort of work that's been done in philosophy. And so I'm just going to offer some broad strokes here because there's contemporary accounts that build on these accounts and the criticisms of them. So first, the forward-looking accounts. So they were popular in the early 20th century, and then they fell out of favor, and then there's some more recent renewed interest. So what they're saying in these accounts is an agent can be offered certain incentives, praise or blame, to move the agent to make specific choices to ensure positive behavioral outcomes. So the idea here is of shaping behavior. around incentives. So having been trained as a speech pathologist in very much a behaviorist mindset, this one kind of, I could see this sort of like consequences. And in the case of moral responsibility, the consequences tend to be things more weighted on the side of blame rather than praise. But basically, it's the idea that you can influence the agent's motives, choices, and behavior. So the next one, reactive attitudes accounts. So the key figure here, and will be important later on in this discussion, is the paper, Freedom and Resentment, by P.F. Strawson, that came out in 1962. And so Strawson goes somewhere else. He focuses on our interpersonal practices and to the agent instead of looking at antecedent events and justifications. Because Strawson argues that our moral sentiments are useful to theory building on responsibility. And so we respond and react to the agent's quality of will. So we hold agents responsible or not when we discern the will that is expressed in their behavior. So Strawson, I'm going to leave it there for a second. So an example that I could give is my colleague John is also here on this call or this presentation. So if I knock over John's coffee and burn his hand, John will wonder, did she do that on purpose or was it accidental? So if he decides, based on knowing me and that sort of thing, that I did it on purpose, that I showed disregard for him or a wish to injure him, he'll respond by feeling resentment, which is appropriate and fitting if indeed I was doing this on purpose, because I did not show him due regard or I ignored him, right? But note how this changes if I have a mobility or coordination problem. John will exempt me, and because I couldn't have done otherwise. So that's sort of what the flavor of what Strawson is saying. So it's the quality of my will. Did I, was it on purpose or accidental? And then the third one is the third strand is called reasons responsiveness accounts. So the main point here is we focus on the actual causes of an agent's behavior. So did this agent act for his own reasons? So we ask if the agent has the capacity to be sensitive to rational considerations that bear on his actions. So this came about as a response to a philosopher named Harry Frankfurt, who claimed that you have power to do an action and you have the power to do something else instead. So you have alternatives. And that's called regulative control. So important people here are Fisher and Vavica, who were responding to Frankfurt, and they said, no, you don't need to be faced with alternatives because you have guidance control. So because you can reflect and guide your behavior in a particular direction by your reasons, the reasons that you give. So to illustrate that, Fisher and Vavica give the example of hypnosis. So a person is not morally responsible for their actions when they're in hypnotic state because they can't reflectively guide their behavior in a way that we require in order for them to be morally responsible. So they're no longer guided by their reasons. So that's a third strand in philosophical thought on responsibility. So, so far we get a sense that pinning down the idea is a pretty gnarly problem. And there's still some lingering questions here. So are there different senses in which people may be morally responsible for their behavior? And important people, contemporary people, would be Gary Watson and Susan Wolf. And Susan Wolf wrote a book called Freedom Within Reason. And I have a quote here from that because it gets into the idea of self. So Susan Wolf writes, an agent's behavior is attributable to the agent's real self if she is at liberty or able both to govern her behavior on the basis of her will and to govern her will on the basis of her valuational system. So what she's saying here, she's responding to the example of the hypnotic person, right? And notes that this person can't govern his behavior from because it's not accessible to him in a hypnotic state. So he's not responsible. So Wolf wants us to consider how did this, she goes a little bit further. This person doesn't have access to their real self in this hypnotic state or under this influence. So she wants to consider, though, how did this person get their value system in the first place? Because that's what guides behavior and moral responsibility in the present day. And so she points to formation. That's my word, formation. And that's because I work here in Catholic Health. We use that word. But it would be one's upbringing or personal history. So Wolf points to an example that she uses, a couple of different examples, but one example would be somebody who had a traumatic childhood. So we judge the moral quality of the self within that person that led to a distorted moral vision. Right. So a couple of other examples that I thought about, she's sort of pointing here to moral competence, the ability to recognize and respond to moral considerations as being a condition of moral responsibility. So impaired agents can't tell right from wrong. They aren't aware of the moral rules. So they're not actually disrespecting others, so they're not blameworthy. Some examples that I think of, because I worked with a brilliant social worker who had grown up in a refugee camp. And she sometimes jokingly would talk about refugee camp behavior. And it came up in the context of my feelings that a family was lying to me. And she pointed out that they may be lying, right? But that's a survival technique. So it became part of their sort of self, because not that they were deceitful in a malicious way, but it's part of their formation, having survived in that camp. So I thought that was a really interesting thing and goes to Susan Wolf's point. So I want to come back to, though, the second one, the Strawson one about quality of will, because I think this might be useful for us in the settings that we work in. So it was Strawson, again, freedom and resentment, and focusing on our interpersonal practices and that we're reacting to the qualities of will that, I described when I tipped over John's coffee. Was it on purpose or accidentally? And it brings us into the realm of moral sentiments. Our reactions tell us something about what responsibility is. Strawson, though, is really, he doesn't parse it very much. He just kind of gives you this, one size fits all idea of a quality of will. And that gets challenged by David Shoemaker, who we'll go to next. So he's pointing out, and this is something that philosophers often do, we look for counterexamples. right? And so we hold the person responsible when we discern the will expressed in their behavior. Sometimes we're ambivalent, and he offers a list of people where we might be ambivalent about whether this person is responsible. So people with autism, people with mild cognitive disability, mild moderate dementia, clinical depression, adverse childhood experiences, and psychopathy. So we ask, are they fully responsible or only responsible in some sense? And he points out that there must be something more going on here when we have these responsive reactions. So he goes on to, this is an example that I wanted to give at this point just to kind of get you thinking. So Martha has moderate dementia. So she's one of these people that has a foot in and out of the moral community, so to speak, as Shoemaker points out. And I'm helping her dress for the day. And she pinches me harshly and spits and calls me a bad name. To me, in that moment, it seems inappropriate to be angry with Martha or have moral system. I know her condition, so I have an idea that she's incapable in certain ways, but still I feel angry with Martha and I wonder. So Shoemaker asks us, is Martha responsible in some sense that accounts for my ambivalence? And so what he does is then he takes a look at the kinds of responsibility responses that we have. And while we have a whole lot of emotional responses to people, he's picked these three pairs because these are the ones that seem to be triggered in situations where responsibility is questioned. So disdain or admiration, pride or regret, anger or gratitude. So Shoemaker says that what we're looking for is what is fitting, what fits the situation. So what fits our emotional responsibilities are the properties of the agent to which our human emotions are built to respond. And so he goes further and says that when we're in this place where we're trying to discern, we're evaluating the quality of will based on the quality of the person's character, their judgment, and their regard. So he's parsing it out into three parts. So we're asking what kind of agent this person is, which, what sort of person is this? Is it an honorable person, a deceitful person, a mean person? We ask about the judgments this person makes. Is this a consistent judgment? This person has their reasons for doing what they do based on their value system. Remember back to Susan Wolf. And also, another thing that will trigger us is how this person regards us. So how this person views others. And we know that some people don't have a good sense of other. I worked with children with autism, and one of the features is an inability to see the other, right, as an independent agent. So Shoemaker's basically saying that certain facts about an agent will make us exempt them from our responsibility responses, like Martha. We may exempt Martha. And those are our sort of emotional appraisals of the situation. Let me see if I'm in them. No, this case. So he goes further again and says there's three dimensions to responsibility. So they track different qualities of will. So remember, Strawson was only talking about quality of will. Here he's pulling it out a little bit more and saying, attributability. So my action is not just in my control, but reflects my character traits that are consistent over time. As I said, honest, deceitful, reliable, those are character traits. Answerability, to answer for my action, to respond with reasons or judgments of what's worthy to me or what's not. So this would be in the realm of what are my cares and commitments. not just my whims and desires, but the really enduring cares and commitments that I have. And accountability, and this is the one that we're most familiar with. And I always wanted to tease out what's the difference between responsibility and accountability. And Shoemaker offers here that accountability is the quality of will having to do with whether it's blameworthy or praiseworthy in my regard for others or my empathy towards others. So a marginal agent could be responsible in some of these senses, but not others. So that's why we have to keep our responses open to revision. And so back to Martha. So, we had this event, we had this interpersonal interaction that Strawson and others are now saying we need to pay attention to our reactive responses. And I've got that ambivalence. Well, later in the day, Martha's daughter Jean comes to visit. And because I wanted to tell her, she asked how her mom's doing. I said, well, this happened. And Jean says to me, oh, she's always been like that. When we were children, if we didn't do what she wanted us to do, she would pinch us. And so she kind of rounds that out with some stories that were somewhat reflective of abusing her children. So now I'm kind of like, okay, this is fleshing out the story a little bit more. It changes my discernment of her quality of will because I know that this is an enduring characteristic. So there's some characteristic here. And so, I can flesh it out in terms of like what aspects here can I hold her responsible for. Okay. And so that's what Shoemaker's offering us. And I think that might be useful because we encounter, and all of you in your work encounter people in our lives, people where we might be ambivalent about how responsible is this person morally responsible for that action that they took. So I'm going to leave it there because it's food for thought. Okay. We have some case or some scenarios that will play out differently along the lines of Martha and some of the others who might be marginal agents. So I'll hand it over to you, Cease.
Thanks, Eleanor. We're just going to move right into Scott's presentation.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I am very grateful and thankful to be presenting to you today, and a little intimidated because I read the participant list, and let's just say I better stick the landing on this one. So I'm going to.
And we have 93 people with us right now.
93. I
That'll
know.
scare you a little bit more.
Exactly. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. And all right. So my presentation today is going to be coming not so much from the philosophical points of view, but from sociology and social psychology. So some of the terminologies will be shared and some of them will not. But let's see where we go and how we get there. So today, I hope to be able to present to you and that there'll be some opportunities to learn how the social nature of humans and the social world we've constructed affects our notions of responsibility. So rather than the philosophical notion of responsibility, the idea of social responsibility, what motivates us to be responsible. How vulnerability has shaped moral and social responsibility, how privilege and precariousness shape how responsibility works. And then, of course, how healthcare as a social institution is founded upon and sustained by social responsibility. So just starting off, babies! So nothing like starting out a presentation with a cute baby. But ultimately, when we talk about the human condition, the fundamentals of the human condition, we're going to be talking about babies. And isn't that baby cute? So starting out with the idea that humans are born social, not moral. And I did bring this up in a previous presentation, but the idea that from the moment we're born, we're dependent upon the social world for more than just sustenance and security, but for the very development of the self. And in philosophy, the idea of the self, especially going back to Eleanor's presentation, the self is the center of responsibility. And so from a sociological or a psychological point of view, the development of the self comes out of the social world. The infant caregiver pair bond is foundational to how we develop the self. And that humans are born with various capacities. And one of those capacities is language. And we're born with the capacity for language, but we're not born with language. You're not born with English downloaded into your operating system. You have to learn that from outside of yourself. And so it's only through the social world that we become more than just biological entities. We're more than just animals. We become human because we're connected to other people. First, our caregivers, and then the larger communities that we begin to interact with. And this is because humans are born profoundly vulnerable. Unlike other animals and even other mammals, we are unable to provide for ourselves or protect ourselves from even the most innocuous threats for an inordinate amount of time. So as a species, we evolved to favor our brains. That's why we're called Homo sapiens, wise man in Latin. But we did that at the expense of claws, of venom, of armor, of all the things that would make us more independent as younger animals. So to compensate, human beings evolved to be social. We evolved so that we can address those fundamental susceptibilities, especially when we're younger, and even when we're older, or when we're sick, or when we are experiencing some form of injury, that we can compensate as a group. So we are inbuilt with this response of social motivation. We respond to vulnerability by taking responsibility. In addition, as social beings, we also expect, assign, and attribute responsibility. We don't just expect to be responsible for people, but we also assign responsibility to people. We have an innate sense of what is called reciprocity, that the social world gives and takes, that there is an economic sense to being in the social world. We respond to others and we expect them to respond to us. So we're not just responsible for each other, but to each other. So many anthropologists and sociologists would argue that human society was built out of suffering, how to avoid it, how to mitigate it, and how to prevent it. So starting off as hunter-gatherers, of course, we were very much at the mercies of the physical world, whether or not there was enough to hunt, whether or not you could gather enough food. Those were all predicated on the vast variabilities of the physical world. So we were pushed to do things like farming. So instead of going out and trying to find food, we'd actually plant food so that we would prevent starvation for both ourselves and our communities. The same thing around ranching, raising animals. Doing all of those things and creating societies around, like building cities, creating all of the aspects of what we would call society came out of a sense of we want to avoid, mitigate, and prevent suffering. Our oldest myths often talk about these terrible disasters and deprivations and how the human race survived by embracing some form of social order. So as we evolved over time, we created layers upon layers of morality to respond collectively to vulnerability and need. We became more civil and therefore became more civilized. Civilization comes out of that sense of social motivation. The unfortunate thing is that the social world is not without its flaws. We're not just born social, we're born survivors. We have that deep, primitive part of our brain, the reptilian brain, the primate brain, that we understand that the world we live in is inherently dangerous, it's unpredictable, it's limited, and we respond accordingly out of that. So deep within ourselves is the capacity to prioritize our own needs and the needs of our particular group. And in sociology, that's called in-grouping. Above the needs of other groups or other people. So we're not just vulnerable from the physical world. We're not just vulnerable from disease, from disaster, but we're also vulnerable from within the social world. So we struggle with where responsibility lies and with whom. So our own sense of morality doesn't just emerge solely out of our social experience of vulnerability and suffering, but also our own individual experiences that I matter and that my survival matters and the survival of my group, my family matters. So from vulnerability comes responsibility. So since the Enlightenment in many Western societies, a lot of emphasis has been placed on the idea of individualism and liberty from collective interference. So we are free under Enlightenment thought to choose our responses to vulnerability and suffering. So philosophers such as Locke and Kant expanded upon the idea of cogito ergo sum. And I hope I pronounced that right for all of you that speak Latin. I think, therefore I am. And so under this idea of individualism, the individual is at the center of all morality. And the private self is ontologically prior to the social world. We are before the social world. And that autonomy and equality is called formal equality, that all individuals are dealt with equally before the law, before government, as its foundational principles of what we would consider a liberal society. However, those philosophical approaches, liberal and libertarian principles, have to contend with the universalness of human suffering. So we go all the way back to our vulnerability. So when you look at the slums of 19th century London and the impacts of the Industrial Revolution and what social movements came out of that, or the devastation of the Spanish flu and what social movements came out of that, and the sobering and devastating effects of World War II, modern society has been forced to confront the limits of individual effort. We can't just do this on our own. The individual has been placed on this pedestal, but that pedestal can be knocked out from underneath you by these significant experiences of suffering. And so we've had to deal with suffering and vulnerability in unimaginable ways, especially within throughout human history. But just looking at COVID and how we had to deal with that, not just individuals, but as our collective response. So the social world has also been forced to confront the fact that exposure to vulnerability and suffering has not been apportioned equally. So we look at the tragedies of slavery, the residential school system, colonization. We look at what's happening around the world when it comes to war, when it comes to famine. And we realize that our society has evolved to put certain groups at greater risk so as to promote the survival and the success of other more favored groups. So where does that leave us today? Well, legal scholar Martha Feynman first articulated what is known as vulnerability theory as a critique of liberal individualism and the idea of formal equality. Feynman argues that all people are vulnerable. And as such, society and state institutions have an obligation to promote not formal equality, but substantive equality. Substantive equality is the idea that all people should have equal access to the systems and resources necessary to reduce, ameliorate, and compensate for that vulnerability. So Feynman presents the idea that although vulnerability is universal and everyone is vulnerable, regardless of your station in life, regardless of where you are geographically, she also explains that resilience is not. Because of where we're located in the social world, some individuals are made more or less resilient due to their experience of the social world, due to their interactions with the social world. And so the state, through its institutions, either reinforces privilege and advantage or prejudice and disadvantage to either mitigate or exploit vulnerability. So there's an argument within modern literature that capitalism in and of itself as an economic system exploits the vulnerability of some people to the advantage of others. So Feynman attempts to address this through a legal argument. And she says that our legal and governmental systems should be responsible for ensuring that social institutions are justly structured and fairly functioning, so that we can fairly support the functioning of persons, all persons, in the face of vulnerability. So Feynman's work highlights the needs to examine new ways of defining the human experience and how the social world should respond to suffering and need. However, Feynman's work is criticized on one point especially, in that Feynman tends to substitute one absolute, the Enlightenment absolute of the ideal individual, the private self, for another, which is the vulnerable person. And that she substitutes one solution, which is limited government, which comes out of libertarianism, for another one, which is paternalism. And of course, we have to then struggle with how that's going to work. Another philosopher talks more about the idea of precariousness versus vulnerability. And so Judith Butler, in her seminal work, Precarious Life, promotes another framework for us to examine the universality of human suffering. But she does it within the context of complex social interactions that create inequality through its history, scope, the impact on individuals and on groups and on communities. So Butler, like Feynman, argues that vulnerability is a universal concept. It happens to everybody, but it's experienced in unique ways that are shaped by where we're located in the social world. We're all living precarious lives. We all live often at the whims of the universe. And again, COVID is a great example of that. It just happened. Regardless of its causal factors, ultimately, we all had to live through this communal experience of a pandemic virus that infected the entire planet. We were all vulnerable to that experience. But the impact of that suffering and the grief that's experienced, and Butler really focuses on grief, was more or less real by where we were located in the social world. And just looking at how COVID affected marginalized and racialized communities was a good way to demonstrate that certain communities were more vulnerable to the impacts of COVID than others. I work in long-term care. One very vulnerable community that's marginalized, that's often hidden away, are individuals that are older, that individuals that have chronic health conditions, individuals that have various forms of capacity. We institutionalize them, and then they're behind those four walls and a ceiling, and they're hidden away. They're not economic participants, and so they're given less importance. But they experienced more of the impact of COVID than practically any other population. Butler frames responsibility as the action that reflects our solidarity in suffering. So as social creatures, we witness the suffering of others and we're compared to share in their grief. We've created these extraordinary social experiences, to share grief, funerals, ceremonies, all of these different ways that we share grief with one another. And that shared grief is the basis of the moral experience. We are moved to do something in response. So that's another form of social motivation. On the other hand, Butler argues that when we limit that grief, when we say that my grief is more important than your grief, or that group's grieving is less important. So when we talk about Indigenous people in Canada and the suffering and grief that they've experienced through colonization, there are some quarters that would say that that's not important, that's something that's in the past. But that grief and that experience is very present today. And who's responsible? Was it Johnny MacDonald that was responsible? Was it our forefathers that were responsible? Or are we responsible right now? So we're drawn back into the I and away from the you and the we. We're drawn back into the private self, and we disconnect ourselves from the social world. We deny the reality of the other person, the other that was there when we learned language, the other that was there when we learned the fundamentals of what it is to be human. And instead, we sink deeper into what Butler calls the delusion of autonomy, that we are fully separate and autonomous from the world in which we developed and which we live. So what do we do? So the central part of my presentation is the idea that healthcare is founded upon and sustained by responsibility, our very real response to suffering and vulnerability, to precarity as social beings and moral agents. It's beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice in action. And this is where the idea of autonomy is a point of contention, because autonomy in that model is oddly located within healthcare. When we think of autonomy within healthcare practice, it protects the individual from unwanted care, and it empowers patients through the rather mechanical concept of informed consent. As long as we get their consent, as long as I explain to you what's going on, and I get you to sign that piece of paper, then we're good. And so what we see is that tends to insulate people from fully participating in their care, except as a passive participant. And Engelhardt would call this the principle of permission. So healthcare then becomes an economic transaction that will always be based on reaction rather than prevention. So let me expand a little bit on that. We often talk about that the healthcare system is very reactive. We put a lot of our resources into emergency rooms, into ICUs, and into all these things. But if we just put more into preventing healthcare crises, into living healthfully, then we would probably have less impacts upon acute care. It makes sense. But in order to live healthfully, to have that preventative sense to healthcare, we all have to agree on what that looks like. And we all have to contribute to that. And that's where autonomy gets to be a little bit sticky. Another thing about healthcare and autonomy is that autonomy requires a legal person. That's the private self. So when I'm very blessed to be part of the ethics committee in Covenant Health. I'm a member of our provincial on-call ethics team, and I can pretty much say that our challenging cases often crest on the shoals of autonomy. So either by the legal person, and that's either the patient or their alternate decision maker, exerting their autonomy in opposition to the healthcare team. I want this or I don't want this, and the healthcare team then is in distress because it's going in opposition to what their best recommendations are. Or the actual lack of a legal person. This person has dementia. This person can't make a decision. So then what do we do? But again, how does autonomy help us? The healthcare system is built to be responsible and to take responsibility for people. Like when someone comes into our emergency rooms and they're unconscious, those doctors, those nurses, that healthcare team is taking responsibility for that individual. We actually have created legal hedges around that very activity. Without autonomy, though, the drive to be responsible, what drove me to become a healthcare professional, was not autonomy. It was that I have this sense of social motivation, this sense of responsibility, that I want to care for other people. But that can go from giving care to people to taking care of people. That drive can quickly become about paternalism, about what I want and what I think is right, versus what the person in the bed or in that chair opposite me wants and feels they need. So the patient becomes a means to a social end. The community is healthier, but the individual is compromised. So how do we balance between these two prevailing forces, between responsibility, this sense of social motivation, and the need for the individual to say that I matter? So this has been floating around and talks about autonomy forever. Autonomous action should not be subjected to the controlling strains of others. And again, that's a sound principle on paper, but it doesn't reflect reality, because we're all consciously, subconsciously, and unconsciously affected by other people. We just are. It's the nature of being in the real world, in a social world. There are people like B.F. Skinner very classically said, free will is an illusion. Any choice you make was really predicated upon how you were programmed by the social world to act in this particular moment. So rather rallying against that, and that one could argue that the principle of autonomy needs to be nested in social context and in the activities of the community. Very few deliberate choices do not have an impact on others, especially in healthcare. When a patient chooses a particular direction, when a healthcare provider chooses a particular treatment, it has significant effects on other people. When a doctor orders something, I've always said, these are doctor's orders, not doctor's suggestions. These are things that we are usually told, this is the way we're going. This is the quarterback telling us this is how the play is gonna go out. And look at that, I used a sports metaphor, it's amazing. But the idea of it is that we have to start looking at choice and autonomy and responsibility in a different way. So how do we do that? To better balance responsibility with the needs and wishes and beliefs and choices of the people that we're responsible for, I would argue that we need to introduce narrative into the space. The narrative of both healthcare and the patient. That we often focus on the what and the how, but not the why. I've been a healthcare professional for 23 years now. And right from the very beginning, I was taught to ask questions. But what questions did I ask? I asked hows and whys. I asked hows and whats, but not so much around the whys. Like, why is this person approaching healthcare? And sometimes it's obvious. When a person's broken their leg, or when a person has developed a cancer, it seems on its face that that's the reason why they've approached healthcare. But really, what are their underlying motivations? What do they see as the outcome of their healthcare? We have an idea of what the outcome is. We set the bone, we deal with the tumor, we move on. But is that what the patient wants? And that's where I think autonomy comes to its fullest flourish. By bringing that narrative into play, we can get closer to the patient and their suffering, and we offer the ways that we have to deal we offer them our ideas around how to alleviate, ameliorate, and eliminate that suffering. So through narrative and the shared meaning and purpose that narrative provides, we can create, even for the briefest of moments, a healing community, which within Covenant Health is one of our primary purposes. It's our mission, it's our vision, it's our values around how do we create that healing. So I hope I landed the dismount on this presentation. Thank you very much, everybody. One book I'd like to recommend, and I'm going to just stop sharing my screen.
Yep.
So there's an excellent book by D. Micah Hester on the community is healing. You can't see it because it's going to get blurred. it's an excellent book. It's a tiny book called Community is Healing by D. Micah Hester. They're a professor of biomedical ethics at the Mercer University School of Medicine in Georgia. And I highly recommend this book. It's a tiny book. You should be caffeinated before you read this book because it's a little dense. It's not light reading, but it's incredible reading. So if you do have the opportunity to pick up this book, you can get it on Amazon. That's my plug for that particular capitalist organization. I will then hand it off to Cecilia for the next aspect of our seminar today.
Thank you so much. Just want to really thank Scott and Eleanor for their presentations. Both really, really terrific presentations. Just in light of time, we're going to look at moving into our small groups right away. We'll have Oge will put us into three or into a number of different small groups, but I know that Eleanor had 3 different scenarios that we were going to put in the chat box with some group discussion questions. So I'm wondering if Eleanor, you could share those, and Oge share those in the chat screen. One of the things, if someone in the small group could choose to be the keep track of comments and discussion, so that when we come back into the larger group, we'd be able to share some of the thoughts and the themes of what folks have to talk about in their discussions. So while you guys are doing that, I'm just going to read some of the comments. There was this comment from Dean that said, from a spiritual care perspective, one thought is that we develop spirituality through how we deal with and live in suffering. I wonder if if we grow socially more through suffering than to avoid it. And the book title is there, and we can loop into Covenant Library to see if they have the book. And then there's another comment that says we need to look at our desires and how we imitate one another to obtain what we desire. Theory known as mimetic theory of Rene Girard. So thank you for those comments. So we have 3 scenarios.
Yes, I'll introduce the 3 scenarios and I'll read through them. What I want you to do is perhaps you were taking notes when we were doing our presentations. So use those notes to help you with your discussion. We hope we have ample time for that. I do want to say, and I want to acknowledge Scott for reminding me of this, that sometimes when you read a story, it may be in some way upsetting to you. It may trigger something in your own life, in your own experience. So do take care. And if you need to, you might not want to participate or just listen. However you wish to proceed. So this first one is taken from an experience that I had as an ethicist. Scenario A, Gladys and Anna live in long-term care. One day at mealtime, Sue, an HCA, observes them from across the room engaging in a loud verbal exchange, which concludes with Gladys tipping a bowl of hot soup in Anna's lap. Some background. Gladys suffered a stroke that resulted in hemiplegia. When she was young, Gladys lost her 2 children to the child welfare system. For years, she lived variously in shelters and on the street. 4 years ago, her adult children located her, and when she had her stroke, found a long-term care placement for her. Anna, who emigrated to Canada following World War II, successfully raised her family and lived independently in her home until she was diagnosed with dementia. Presently, she's diagnosed with moderate dementia, and she uses a wheelchair to ambulate. Scenario B, Tom and Jesse are grade 9 students. Their schoolyard backs onto a wooded ravine. One day at recess, Tom ties Jesse to a tree in the ravine and leaves him there. Returning to class, the teacher asks about Jesse. Tom lies and says that Jesse took off from the schoolyard to head home. At the end of the day, Jesse is found by the school custodian slumped at the bottom of a tree trunk, still tied with a rope. When confronted by his teacher the next day and asked why he did this to Jesse, Tom said, "I don't know," as he shrugged and smiled at her. This event is one of a string of events that the teacher finds disturbing about. Scenario C. Michael is a RN in an outpatient renal dialysis program. Lately, his colleagues have noticed that he leaves his paperwork unfinished. He isn't managing his patient load in a way that makes sense to others. At times, he appears disengaged in his surroundings, sitting with his cell phone, apparently scrolling through Facebook posts. Kate, his colleague and friend, tells others he's just not himself anymore. Others are angry with Michael, saying he's just not pulling his weight and risking patients. So I want you to, in your groups, to think about first of all, what are your reactions, your reactive responses to whether these individuals are responsible in the way that we described. And then if your discussion runs out, then I'm inviting you to be creative and add to the stories and see if that changes your reactive responses around responsibility. So, Oge, if you could assign people, that would be great.
I'm sure everyone's discussions were amazing. And as usual, we didn't have enough time. So, but we would love to hear back from the groups in terms of what discussions different groups had. So is there someone who'd like to go first?
I don't mind trying my best to summarize the collective wisdom from our group. We actually worked through every scenario, ABC. Again, we could talk about this all day. It's quite fascinating. We pulled on a lot of, what role do we play? What is the scope and what is the role based on each scenario? We, I think, did a really great job about looking at the system and at what point in each system did things break down. And, we also talked a lot about, answerability, accountability, capacity, moral competence, the sentiment that a lot of the scenarios pulled in us were, who's the victim here? Is this wrong time, wrong place? When we don't have the information, because sometimes we simply can't have all the information, what do we do? How do we deal? What does that elicit within us? We go on fact-finding missions, we do investigations, we default to fundamentals and protocols and check all those things that we have in place based on that to ensure safety. Where's the social responsibility, like Scott challenged us, Will? Where does government come in? Where does family come in? All those kinds of things. So very robust discussion. Anyone from my group to kind of add? It's hard to, let's say, theme it all when we really did unpack each scenario, but I think those are kind of the threads that we talked about in our discussion.
I would only add this, I think you did a great job, Cindy, is that when somebody said, this is my reaction to it, I think, Cindy, you did that a number of times, like it was the safety thing, or what about, the child and how he was cared for or not cared for. So going into the heart and feeling what's wrong, and then as a way to delve into something, I think that was a really good way to do it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Another group?
I'll go cease from group 5.
Thanks, Nita.
You're welcome. So much like the last group and Cindy's synopsis, you kind of look through the scenarios, and I think we did a bunch of the same thing as automatically. I said, well, number 1, I want to get a hold of that boy in scenario number 2, and we need to have a conversation. But in kind of going over the scenarios and whatnot, and trying to immerse it with some of the education that was brought to us in this session, around moral, around social. Eleanor teased apart brilliantly and asked one of my questions: where's responsibility and where's accountability? Are we using them interchangeably? Are we using them correctly? When we're looking at things, are we looking more for accountability? Did they have the capacity to know they've done wrong? But I think really more for us was every scenario needed much more investigation. And at the base of all of this, it's always to look for and understand the why. Why is this behavior manifesting? Why is this coming up? Why are we having this issue? Because without having that background information, this is what we find in ethics all the time. It's very easy to make a snap decision, but when you start digging into a little more information, all of a sudden your answer is very far from cut and dry. So there was definitely the need to take a little more time with each personal interaction and find out what's going on, and ask the questions and find out, is this more social? Is this moral? Am I the one having the reaction to this because of something in my past, etc.? So yeah, it was, again, a lot of robust discussion and just trying to talk to and understand, and also realizing how the 3 different scenarios were set up. The first scenario, we had what seemed like a lot of background information versus the last scenario where we had very little information. So we were much more apt to have a better understanding of where we were going in scenario 1 and scenario 3, because then we were forced to hypothesize some, well, is there depression present? Is something going on in their world? So again, I think our theme just came back to look at that question, why? But then Pearl was very good too, and stepped forward and said, but you also have to be careful how sometimes you ask that question, why? Because why can be a definite introduction to you've done something wrong. And if you have somebody who's already very intimidated by a system, or already very not sure of who are their friends and who are not their friends, by asking that question, why, very directly, you may not get any form of answers that can cause a complete shutdown. So just how we're attending to these things, the way we're asking, the intent in which we're trying to learn, but always going back to try to understand that question, why, to then discover, are they responsible or not responsible?
Thank you, Anita.
You're welcome.
Sounds like it was a great discussion. Anyone else want to share?
Yeah, Cecil, I'll just share briefly on behalf of our group, and I've invited our group to chime in where I stray from the accuracy of our conversation. But similarly, I think maybe I'll break it down in a few ways. So the why was a big, I think, component of our conversation, seeking understanding of the scenarios and what the layers are behind it. So that was the second component, is the significance of the layers, different facets of understanding. A theme around kind of community responsibility versus individual responsibility, and some conversation around that, and a piece around clarifying the responsibility in the first place. So what is it that is being held up as an expectation, and for what and for whom? And so that connected to another sort of area of conversation: who is responsible and for what? And a facet that is sort of a takeaway for me from the conversation is, being responsible for, so we see the primary acting agents in a scenario, in each of those three scenarios, or a not acting agent with a responsibility. So there's the piece that I'm taking away is, how am I, maybe as a non-primary actor, what is my responsibility to help others live into their responsibility? And so that was a comment by one of our participants in our room, that sort of taking away of like, oh yeah, it's not just simply like, oh, look over there, those people have responsibilities and whatnot, and now I can just watch to see if they fail to live up to their responsibilities. How am I in participant in that scenario to help someone be successful in living up to their moral accountability and responsibility? So anyways, in my group, if anyone else is interested to share their thoughts, please do so.
Oh, sounds like you did a good job, John. Anyone else like to comment? Denise said you did a good job in the chat, John. Excellent from Tammy. All right, well, I'm just conscious of the time, so maybe I'll just again thank Eleanor and Scott for their sharing of their knowledge. I think that I can't imagine anyone who didn't, after attending this, it hasn't broadened your knowledge and your perspective on responsibility. I think one of the things similar to what you said, John, just how it's very circular in terms of, we have all gotten into healthcare or the jobs that we're in because we have a sense of responsibility, but how we act in that role, it does create a social response that someone is going to be part of. So as we are everyday part of our work, we create that social response for people. And so that requires us to constantly self-reflect on how we respond in any situation. And the other comment that I thought also stuck with me was how, because of that social responsibility, we in giving care, we can sometimes take it away, and just how do we ensure that we don't move too far into that, and that we're always looking for opportunities to create a social structure that offers people opportunity to change and be different in their life. And certainly that takes a slowing down, like we know in our jobs, and a need to ask lots of questions and to seek to understand over and over again. That's kind of where we land. So thank you everyone for attending. Again, there will be the evaluation. So appreciate your feedback so we know if we're on track and what other things you might be interested in. On another note, and I had mentioned it at our last quarterly, we were going to do a ethics conference in the spring. We've had to change that date to the fall because of Connect Care and other priorities. So that will be happening on November 9th in the fall, and that save the date will be coming out. And we do know, and we're cognizant that the rural sites will be in the midst of Connect Care. So we're looking at bringing the conference to you. So we'll be visiting 4 rural sites in the spring from January to June. So we look forward to getting out and seeing everybody in person and gathering at the conference in the fall. I just want to thank the planning committee for creating this seminar and all the work again that Eleanor and Scott did in researching and creating those wonderful presentations. So thank you to Oge, who kept us on track and moved us in and out of the groups very smoothly. Appreciate all the support that you give us. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Bye.